Master games. Trainers as guarantors of the art of exaggeration. Cura and cultura. In its least muddled definition, the term culture refers to grooming systems for the transmission of regionally essential cognitive and moral principles to subsequent generations. Because this transmission is always a source of serious intelligence work, all actually successful cultures sufficiently capable of reproduction develop a form of central ontological organ that passes judgment on the vital or non-vital status of things. 6,000 feet beyond the philosophical distinction between the substantial and the accidental. Thus, things are always already matters for negotiation in the forum of survival intelligence. In a related sense, Bruno Latour presented a groundbreaking reformulation of the thing concept for the agenda of a world of plural parliaments. In this organ, which in earlier times was consistently administered presbyterocratically in councils of elders, and in more recent times with democratic tendencies, that is, drawing on a mixture of institutional intelligence, expert opinion, and popular opinion, resides an unspecialized totipotente power of judgment that attends to its duties long before the separation of reality fields into ethical, political, and aesthetic. For the sake of calibration with reality, it presides over the two most important categories of practical reason, the judgments of emergency and priority. That is to say, it recognizes states of emergency and decides on the order in which the most important things should be taken care of. The fact that fallibility is one of its working conditions in no way devalues the activity of this power of judgment. The cultivation dimension of cultura here refers to the concern for the eternal return of the similar in subsequent generations. Where cura and cultura, concern and cultivation, appear, they initially serve the purpose of similarity. Similarity demands that the members of a population always behave in such a way that the sum of acts in the group can produce a sufficient number of similar juniors. Whoever behaves in an unconcerned or non-cultivating fashion here permits uncontrolled growth that will more often seem decadent than original. In this context, we should once again recall the basic neophobic mentality of older cultures. The wonder of later, liberally opened civilizations can be expressly defined against this background. It is the possibility for a given population to have become sufficiently sure of its reproductive capability, its didactic techniques, and the attractiveness of its mode of life to be able to afford to dispense with the long-standing suppression of unwelcome variation, and instead embrace the new hazardous habitus of a broad tolerance for variation. This leads to the typical late cultural problems that occupy us daily today. They grow from the non-peaceable coexistence of variation-hostile and variation-friendly groups within a civilizatorily asynchronous state population. Stabilized improbability, the erection of models. Against this background, the appearance of early advanced civilizations seems all the more amazing. To define them, I shall fall back on my reflections on the stabilization of high vertical tensions in secessionarily isolated groups. On the basis of these, advanced civilization means nothing other than a system for the reproduction of hyperbolic or acrobatic functions in spaces of retreat for elites, whose general form appears in an ethics of stabilized improbability. Hence the acrobat, both in a literal and in a figurative sense of the word, takes centre stage as the carrier of a long-term near impossibility, at the expense, incidentally, of the conventional equation of aristocracy and elite. It was Nietzsche who first noted that true aristocracy reveals itself in the way that, in the spiritual leader, the tremendous impossibility of the task is translated into a refined bodily posture. We know, admittedly, that the stabilization of extreme improbabilities can generally only take place via the erection of models. Understandably, these are not only intra-familiarly transferable, but must be passed on via the collective imaginary, that is to say, through the mental practice and ranking systems of a culture. Shortcuts only exist in milieus where family and advanced civilization coincide, among Brahmins and rabbis, and in Protestant vicarages. When we speak of models, we should think first of all only of the exemplarily embodied types of the heroic, sacred, and sporting agon, that is, the heroes of the battlefield, the god-men in the forests and in the reddish dust of field tracks, the saints of the desert and the monastery, and the athletes in the palaestra, the stadium and the arena. They all still have some of the aura of their predecessors, the miracle men of archaic times, the wizards and magical diplomats who negotiated with the power and the demons. They had been the first to captivate those around them as rebels against the block of reality. It was only much later that artists were added to the list, each one of them a miracle maker in their own genre, and thus a blasphemer against the principle of impossibility. With these figures, the roles and spaces of stabilized improbability and advanced civilization are sketched out sufficiently clearly. Once they are established, it is necessary to explain the modes in which the translation of the improbable and unrepeatable into the probable and repeatable, and thus the setting up of the original field of tuition, can take place in each individual area. Initially, only one thing is certain here. What would be called school in later times was at first less of a pedagogical than a thaumaturgical phenomenon. First the miracle, then education, hence the close link between ethics and artistry. When Plato and Aristotle assure us that philosophy begins with amazement, thaumatein, they are just managing to grasp the very end of an order in which all higher achievements were measured in relation to the unbelievable. It was only much later that half-price trivializations and imitations would be able to dictate the agenda. At first, certainly, the introduction to the improbable has nothing to do with guiding children. It is directed at adults who realize halfway through their lives that ordinary human existence is no longer enough. The beginning was not education, but seduction by the amazing. The effects that move humans to secede come purely from the school of wonder. Paradoxes and passions, the genesis of the inner world through chronic overstraining. Advanced civilization, then, is by no means what Oswald Spengler claimed, namely, the result from the encounter between a landscape and a group soul, or the amalgam of a climate and its trauma. No, nor, however, is it simply richness in problems, to quote Egon Friedel's witty definition of culture in the sense of education. Rather, each advanced civilization is rooted in its robust ownership of a paradox that has been made capable of transmission. It stems from the cruel naivete with which the basal paradox embodies itself in its early stages. The naivete of early advanced civilizations is cruel to the extent that it enforces its demand for the enabling of the impossible against its adepts. Only once such hard starting paradoxes have relaxed to form problems can they be enjoyed like riches and collected like educational objects. In their early states, paradoxes are suffered as passions rather than experienced as treasures. let us say clearly where the basic paradox of all advanced civilization lies. It follows from its orientation towards hyperbolic or acrobatic excesses, which are always viewed on the assumption that they are only suitable for imitation or normalization. By elevating exceptional achievements to conventions, advanced civilizations create a pathogenic tension, a form of chronic altitude sickness to which sufficiently intelligent participants in the paradoxical game can only respond with the development of an internal space of evasion and simulation, and thus a soul, a ba, a psyche, an atman, or more generally speaking, an inner world that is permanently, reflexively unsettled. The soul emerges as the entity in which the impossible must be called to mind, like a possibility that constantly has to be considered. Soul, in the sense of a microcosmic or inner world organ for doubling the existent as a whole, is by no means a timeless entity in which the being for oneself of humans from all times and peoples manifests itself. It only comes about as the symptom of an overstimulation by an inescapable paradox, a demand that can neither be met nor ignored. The human interior then ceases to be merely the transit space for upsurging affects, something one can still observe clearly in the Homeric view of thymos, for example. Nor is it any longer simply the reception hall for the visits of demons, dreams, and ideas. It is more like a chronic inflammation of the self-perception, provoked by the imposition that the desire of the individual should align itself with examples that cannot possibly be imitated. The paradoxical inflammation and the stabilized for oneself are the same age. Conversely, advanced civilized ethics only becomes attractive by learning to advertise itself with the highest fascinations, with the physically and morally wonderful. The wonderful is the smile of the impossible. It is only through the transformation of the unbelievable into the exemplary that the working climate of advanced civilization can stabilize itself. When it speaks to its own, it always forgets to mention the complete, who become recommendable for imitation precisely through inimitable achievements. As soon as the acrobinian, the gaze-commanding walk on the rope over the abyss, moves from the physical field to the moral, the paradox comes into play. Vertical tensions of the most exuberant kind come about through the elevation of the inimitable to the status of the exemplary. Twilight of the Trainers. Against this background, the figure of the trainer can be explained as the one who leads the way into improbability. In systemic terms, they have the task of making invisible the paradox of advanced civilization, where precisely that which is impossible to imitate is employed as an incentive to the most intense imitation. Here the strategy presented by Edgar Allan Poe in The Purloined Letter, where the most visible surface provides the best hiding place, proves effective. It is characteristic of the heroic, wholly athletic complex that it conceals its seduction to the impossible under an elaborate legendary noise. First and foremost, this purely serves the purpose of making the contradictory nature of its message, which is immediately noticeable to the calm observer, invisible and inaudible through overexposure and overemphasis. Its second function is to mobilize the mimetic instincts, which cannot tolerate praise for virtues in others that are supposedly lacking in one's own existence. Aretological propaganda fulfills its purpose if, when faced with the question, "What does the other person have that I supposedly do not?" it provokes the answer, "We will see." Admiration is the great vehicle of jealousy, which tolerates no absolute preferential treatment. And if there is one thing that goes profoundly against its nature, it is the private ownership of triumphs over impossibility, accumulated by a supposedly inimitable other. The early attempts to scale the heights of improbability, therefore, are by no means psychodynamically helpless. All explicit advanced civilizations fuel themselves with a mimetic mobilization, whose intention is no less than the disposition of the model. Here too silence is the first working condition. Just as undisturbed quote-unquote cultural activity precludes any exposure of its basal paradox, the driving forces of emulation also remain unconfessable. Reader's note: the use of the word mimesis, mimetic here, indicates mimesis, not memeplex. Only on these premises can one consider the performances of the first trainers with the necessary scenographic attentiveness. Initially, the only people eligible for such a role are the exceptional humans themselves, those who have achieved self-mirabilization, the transformation into the actually existing monstrosity. They radiate the numinous aura that surrounds the highest magisteria. Because the teaching itself is embodied by teachers in their mirabilic otherness at this stage, they display a new form of authority. It is no longer the gravity of the elders, but rather the luminosity of the pure exception that seduces as soon as it is seen and felt. This results in the new, distinguished pedagogical tone. I am the way and the truth and the life. I and the Father are one. I am I, but also the other. I am devoid of honour and dishonour. I am without attributes. I am Shiva. I am free from duality and non-duality. I am free from the pairs of opposites. I am He. A corona of pupils soon gathers around the firstborn of the unheard of, seeking to embody the privilege of emanating directly from the exception. The first round of the transference experiment had already seen the appearance of a phenomenon that accompanies all foundings of schools as an almost tragic shadow: the separation of the suitable from the unsuitable. The efficient spiritual trainer not only develops the prudence of the ancient doctor, who stays away from incurable cases, they also develop the specific perception unique to the fisher of men, who senses those with a natural affinity with the spirit of the teaching among the merely interested. In scholastic times they would be called talented, in the bourgeois era gifted, and for understandable reasons the abstractly universalistic ressentiment would one day be up in arms about the concept of talent as such. It is not only old Manto who loves those who desire the impossible. Everyone who embodies advanced civilized élan does so. What is more important than loving the one who desires the absurd, however, is picking them out from the countless cases in which it would be a waste of effort to attempt a nurturing of the eros of the impossible within an individual. Like Charon, the ferryman of the underworld who conveys a Faust lusting after Helena, all the great trainers accompany those students who will not cease desiring on their way, quote-unquote, across. Ten types of teacher. In the following I shall sketch 5 types of spiritual trainer, of which each, in their own way, fulfills the task of giving exaggerations that are prima vista unlivable, and aim to give the supra-real the semblance of feasibility and livability. First comes the guru of the Brahmanic Hindu tradition, then the master of the Buddhist doctrine of liberation, then the apostle or abbot as imitatores Christi, next the philosopher as a witness to the search for truth, and finally the sophist as a polytechnician of the ars vivendi. It should scarcely be necessary to explain why each of the types embodies a variety of teaching license at the enthusiastic faculty of our anthropological polytechnic. Going through these even more quickly, I shall assign to these figures an analogous five-member set of pragmatic or artistic trainers: the athletic trainer, the master of a craft or virtuosic artistic feat, the academic professor, the mundane teacher, and the Enlightenment author. It is clear enough why one should expect shallower and more anonymous forms of vertical tension from the start among the group of certified teachers. They are all involved in the popularization and standardization of mirabile effects, and in one way or another already on the way to what modernity, after the triumphant initial successes of general alphabetization, would later make its cause under the catchword of quote-unquote general education. Nonetheless, these teachers also purvey a notion of peak performance, albeit one that requires increasing justification. Democracy, they implicitly state, is not such a valid reason to do away with all forms of vertical tension. They remain in effect, though in an altered mode, even if only for the power ecological reason that, even in a world with a strictly egalitarian constitution, not everyone will be able to do everything, let alone do everything equally well. The Guru. The first in this list is the figure of the Indian Guru, a name that is rarely used without irony in the contemporary Western context, as if one wanted to denote a person who gives their followers opportunity to overestimate them, and presumably not without succumbing to self-overestimation first. Naturally, this habitual irony tells us absolutely nothing about Indian conditions, but a great deal about the anti-authoritarian change of mentality among Westerners in general, and about the decline in the standing of the teaching professions in particular. It reveals the scepticism that has been epidemic in the old world for some time towards the notion that any mortal could have more insight than another into the basic conditions of the world and life, not merely in the sense of coincidentally greater knowledge based on longer experience, but thanks to a deeper penetration of the concealed structures of existence. Just as the concept of the master is ruined in Europe, the maestro in musical life being the one exception, so the idea of any higher teaching license in existential matters has practically lost all credit. When Martin Heidegger occasionally used the expression master of reading and living to describe Meister Eckhart, the archaic tone was already unmistakable at the time. In doing so, he was going very palpably against the newer consensus that the discipline of life is under no circumstances open to mastery. The scandal of the guru function is easy to pinpoint. It implies a mode of teaching and learning based on an initiation, and thus a crossing over to the sphere of sacred or non-public knowledge. It is precisely this aspect that makes the guru-centered study model of ancient India unacceptable for the modern learning culture of the Occident. We have introductions to this or that era of knowledge to offer, but do not allow any initiations, quite aside from the fact that enlightenment is not envisaged as the conclusion to a course of study. We also presuppose among our students the continuity of person, from school enrollment to matriculation to graduation, while learning with a guru entails two discontinuous aspects, one at the initiation into the modus ascendi of the pupil, which implies a form of symbolic death, and the other upon the prospective attainment of the highest goal, which Indian convention describes as the insight, gained psychosomatically and via certain states, into the identity of the individual soul and the world soul. This shows how the dramaturgical form of initiatic learning, beyond its trimming through the narrative form of step-based life, is nested in a schema of rebirth, which is why its goal must be sought not so much in a qualification as in a transformation. For Western sensibilities, the convivial, or virtually promiscuous constitution of the Indian master-pupil relationship is even more scandalous than the initiatic alliance that accompanies it. As a rule, devotion to a master in a stationary Brahmanic context implied joining his household, usually for a period that could scarcely be shorter than 12 years. This was usually the time required merely to memorize the Vedic texts whose internalization was expected of adepts, regardless of what practical exercises, asanas, were used to carry out the psycho-physical work of transformation. This household element of the master-pupil relationship implied an openly psycho-feudal dependency. Here the pupil not only had to receive knowledge from the master, but also to fulfill various servant duties, hence the Sanskrit name Antivasin, the one who accompanies the guru and waits upon him. More often, the pupil is referred to as a shishya, or chela, which denotes one who sits at the feet of the master, a word that calls to mind the memory of a lost world before the invention of the universal anthropotechnic device of the modern age, namely the school desk. From an attitude historical perspective, incidentally, modernity is synonymous with the dependence on chairs or other seating furniture, and eo ipso, the dying out of the ability to sit on the floor without feeling burdened by one's own body. The true meaning of the guru-centered learning model, admittedly, does not consist in the cosy, homely aspects, which from a distance recall the life forms of medieval craftsmen's households in Europe. Hence also the threat of terrible consequences for any pupil who dared embark on an affair with the master's wife, although this does not seem entirely outlandish given the informal situation of courtly love. A noble lady and a lowly aspirant in the closest proximity, separated by a strong taboo, and with the attention of each drawn to the other. Its purpose only reveals itself when one takes into consideration the psychodynamic aspect of the master-pupil relationship. This is, after all, no less than a contract for the regulation of a hyperbolic transaction. As soon as the guru takes an antivasan, or chela, into his following, he has implicitly made a form of perfecting contract with him. This means a simultaneously metaphysical and pragmatic alliance with the goal of advancing at least a few steps along the path to actually existing impossibility, or even of realizing the magnum opus as such. Deification in one's lifetime, and transformation into the Jivan Mukti, the one who is saved here and now. The guru and his student thus enter an alliance, perhaps not of life and death, but certainly of life and hyperlife. Viewed by the light of recent Occidental psychological knowledge, this singular relationship is a magnetopathic, or psychoanalytical rapport, that is to say, a stabilized state of emergency in the soul field, where the master makes himself available for the most intense idealizations of the part of the pupil. In contrast to the magnetistic or psychoanalytical situation, however, where, in accordance with the prevailing norms of sobriety, the long-term goal is the dissolution of an idealizing transference, the guru-antivasan relationship aims not for the end, but rather for the clarifying amplification of that idealization, and at once an identificatory intensification that, if carried out in an orthodox and proper fashion, should be driven forwards into the supra-pictorial, pre-objective and pre-personal register. From the guru's point of view, the pupil's idealizing anticipations are not wrong, because they aim too high. Rather, the pupil is not only condemned to a form of indispensable error, in the sense that he cannot yet know how much higher the real goal is located than his dreamy anticipations are capable of imagining. Nonetheless, identification is the most important affective resource that is available for use in transformative work, which is why one part of the craft of guru pedagogy is to keep the fire of the beginner's illusion burning for as long as possible. That an institutionalized art of the impossible cannot be judged by the standards of Western trivial ontology, with the corresponding psychological constructs of normality, is understandable enough. Such references to the hyperbolic dimension in the transformation contract between masters and pupils cannot, of course, refute skepticism towards the guru-centered form of studying. It is therefore anything but coincidental that a large part of Western writings, but also of the growing native literature of the guru phenomenon, not infrequently penned by disconcerted psychiatrists, committed social psychologists, and nervous sect advisors, is devoted to the problem of false masters and the psychological abuse of those dependent on them. The authors consistently postulate the reinforcement of quality control for products on the religious markets. They usually view the situation as if the process of globalization had also cast the spiritual world market into a state of upheaval. Just as some dangerous pathogens today profit from the facilitation of worldwide travel, the memes of the God delusion can also spread more easily beyond the borders of their source regions. Even more disturbing is the impression that psychosis has got carried away and is now aiming to change its status from a classified illness to a misunderstood form of fitness. Most provocative of all, admittedly, is the epidemic of mystical amoralism, which, thanks to the missionary successes of Hinduizing masters, began to spread through the overly receptive Western sphere. The virus, which has nestled in correspondingly arranged classes since then, consists in the dangerous realization that the lack of conscience and illumination are, from a certain point of view, identical. The truth is most probably that the world of Enlightenment games too has been affected by mediatization, and the appearance of performance talents among the teachers of well-tempered impossibility was only a matter of time. No guru's life from the last decades demonstrates the shift more clearly than that of the Indian Enlightenment preacher and sect founder Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh, 1931 to 1990, alias Osho, who, despite his controversial status, constitutes, along with Ramana Maharshi, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, the fourth figure of Indian spirituality in the 20th century, whose aura emanated across the world. His exceptional standing is clearest in the adoption of Western performance techniques among the forms of spiritual instruction, which were otherwise steeped in pious routine. Like a Duchamp of the spiritual field, he transformed all that the relevant traditions into religious playthings and mystical ready-mades. It was not least a testament to his lucidity that, at the pinnacle of his success, he turned himself into a ready-made, and, showing a clear awareness of the change in the zeitgeist, distanced himself from his Hinduizing past. As he recognized just in time, this past was tied too strongly to the mentality wave of Euro-American post-1968 Romanticism. In assuming the Japanese-tinged name Osho in 1989, the joke is over, he quick-wittedly connected to the recently developed neoliberal Buddhaphile mood in the West and invented a label for himself with a promising future. This gesture announced that in the field of guru-centered anthropotechnics too, the age of rebranding had begun. The Buddhist Master. As far as the Buddhist varieties of the teacher's image are concerned, they took part in two evolutionary shifts that profoundly modified the meaning of teaching. In ancient times, in the change of emphasis from the elitist self-redemptive art of the Hinayana, small vehicle, to the compassionate populism of the Mahayana, great vehicle, and in more recent times the epochal shift from a position of radical world and life denial to one of fundamental world and life affirmation. The most important information about the profile of the first teacher on the path of the new teaching probably comes from the Enlightenment legend itself, as told in its Sri Lankan version. In this account, the awakened one waited under the Bodhi tree for 7 days in silence, untouched by everything around him, and experienced the joyful feeling of awakening. He then arose and immersed himself in his detachment for another 7 days under a different tree, then the same again under a third tree. The message of the tale is unmistakable. What took place here is beyond all teaching. No path with signposts leads to such a goal. The event rendered the attempt to produce it obsolete. The bond between truth and method was broken. Nonetheless, this episode and Buddha's later decision to act as a teacher form the point of departure for the most widely ramified scholastic phenomenon in the history of civilization. The teaching grows from the paradoxical act of breaking a silence in full awareness of the fact that the spoken words can never be taken merely at their propositional value, but predominantly as therapeutic directives. The pronouncements of the spiritual teacher are indirect messages of a more hygienic than dogmatic tendency. Equipped with a starting paradox of such power, Buddhism sought to sow the seeds of the incommunicable and unfolded into one of the most loquacious movements in global spiritual culture. In its first half-millennium, it remained the only thing its starting framework would have allowed, a matter for the few, who would nonetheless, under Indian and Indo-Chinese conditions, inevitably become numerous. Though, viewed from a distance, the Buddhist trainers, abbots of monasteries, and advisors of those seeking help seemed merely to embody the continuation of the guru system by slightly different means. Closer inspection reveals that they were in many respects the opposite. They entered the stage of intellectual history as a movement of therapists who, in keeping with their healing mission, were not concerned so much with the transmission of a religious doctrine, an esoteric worldview, or a mystical visionary art. What they had in mind was purely to do away with the conditions of suffering, resolutely beginning with one's own entanglement in the mental processes that create suffering. On taking the salvific motif dominant throughout North India since 500 BC to the extreme, they infiltrated, feeling the zeitgeist fully on their side, the caste-based foundations of Brahmanism and its metaphysical superstructure. Only in terms of the central civilizatory tendency, namely that towards a progressive internalization and subtilization of the sacrifice, can Buddhism also be considered an evolutionary unfolding of late Brahmanic potentials. While older times were dominated by the equivalence of the human and the sacrifice was now shifted entirely inwards, and ultimately it would appear as if nothing had been sacrificed at all. For when humans relinquish the things to which they cling, they part with something that was never substantially their property, in any case. One could see this as an internalization of conventional ascetic nudism, where it is not the body that walks in the garment of air, as practiced by the Digambara, but rather the soul that paradoxically reveals its non-being in nakedness. Admittedly, a number of Buddha's pupils, only a few generations after his death, fell prey to the most extreme fetishism in their interpretation of the monastic rule. The first significant schism, as is well known, took place partly as a result of an embittered debate between abbots over such questions as whether a monk is permitted to store salt in a buffalo horn, which amounted to a violation of the rules for storing food, or whether a monk's sleeping mat is allowed to have loose threads, which would have broken the rule concerning the size of mat. Disputes of a philosophical kind also led to schisms in the schools, such that a few centuries after the master's passing, the well-known 18 classical schools took shape, each one of them divided into numerous subgroups and sectarian fringes, which, in keeping with the universal laws of narcissism, pursued conflicts over the smallest differences. I shall restrict myself here to the question of how Buddhist masters and pupils deal with their contracts about the impossible. Essentially, all the motifs that we know from the relationship between the guru and the disciple return here, complicated by the increase in negativity that characterizes Buddhist teaching in comparison to Brahmanic doctrine. While the guru can act as an accomplice to the pupil's projection for much of the time, the Buddhist teacher has the duty of distracting the projection from his person and deflecting it to the Dharma, the redemptive doctrine, in keeping with the principle of the not-self. The fulfillment of the impossibility contract here gains an additional dimension of crypticism, as the school workload requires that the adepts break even more profoundly with their folk ontological intuitions. In schematic terms, one could say that the guru initiates the student into the simple, counterintuitive truth that the great self of the world and the small ego self are identical, a realization that undoubtedly presupposes intense modifications on the follower's part. The Buddhist teacher, on the other hand, is faced with the difficulty of making a doubly counterintuitive truth seem plausible to the pupil, the identity of world not self and private not self. The extension of this equation is synonymous with Enlightenment more Buddhistico. By its nature, it demands a form of tuition in which students are constantly thrown back to the self-referential nature of their search. They have to learn to find the liberating nothingness in themselves, and then to see through the world as a nothingness, and finally recognize the two nothingnesses as one and the same. Every encounter should give them an opportunity to bid farewell. Where others settle and gather themselves, they must learn to give away and move on. Hence the abundant use of paradoxes that can be observed among many Buddhist teachers. While religious orthodoxies show their interest ex officio in dissolving paradoxes and making their doctrine reasonable, the most recent example being the much-noted Regensburg speech by Benedict XVI, one often recognizes Buddhist instruction, assuming it has not itself been corrupted in a religioid fashion, by its efforts to push its paradoxical character to the threshold of self-refutation, not infrequently to the point where the Dharma is termed a mere mirage. Verbal paradoxes are all projections of the basic ascetic paradox, whereby one conveys to the adept the message that there is nothing to attain, but that to understand this they must first of all sit in meditation for 10 years, ideally for 14 hours a day. Alongside the paradox, the most strikingly stylistic means of recent Buddhism is probably the tautology, especially its Japanese varieties, which are often palatable to the contemporary individualism of the West, though probably only because we tend to confuse the tautologies of negativism and the doctrine of the not-self with those of our positivism. A rose is a rose. In the Occidental context, this celebrates monovalence, or one could call it the idiocy of being, in which the intellect rests. That this cherry blossom is this cherry blossom, on the other hand, means that a manifestation of weak nothingness, a pink transience, comes into momentary contact with a transient eye. Another manifestation of weak nothingness, both against the background of strong nothingness. Intermezzo, the critique of illumination. I shall note in parentheses why the concept of illumination has lost its meaning for European philosophers of modernity. In typological terms, only two philosophically notable forms of illumination have become known. On the one side, the illumination of the substance ontological or spirit ontological type, as present in the Hindu systems, as well as in Platonism and its Christian derivatives. Here, the equation of the world soul and the individual soul, or the infinite and the finite intellect, takes place in a varyingly thorough fashion. On the other side, we encounter enlightenment of the nirvana-logical type, as known from Buddhist traditions. Here, the essential identity of the selflessness of the world and the absence of the substantial soul is realized in the individual. Modern analysis has decisive objections to both of these patterns. In the case of the first variant, the problem is that it ascribes more intelligence and soul to the world than it is due. As far as the inorganic sphere is concerned, its share in the mental and intellectual capacity was judged very reservedly. But the organic world too going on, everything one sees of it, is more a battlefield of confusedly distributed life will points than a reason-animated whole. If people were able to ascribe to it something resembling a comprehensive animation, it was only by means of a transparent projection. This was achieved by taking out a loan from the self-evident animation of the animal noetic sphere and passing this on, multiplied by the value infinity in the imaginary realm, to the world whole. In this respect, ancient India and old Europe are partners in an alliance who understand each other blindly. As far as the soul is concerned, both of them have always wanted too much, and incur massive expenses to keep alive the welcome confusion of totality with animation by the world soul. On the other side, one sees how Buddhism, starting from the partly plausible selflessness and soullessness of the world machine, which it takes for granted thanks to its sober view of the game of constitutions and dissolutions, postulates the selflessness and soullessness of the human interior. This looks like a complementary fallacy. In the same way one borrowed soul from human self-experience to lend it to the cosmos without sufficient securities in the first case, one borrows not selfness from the outside world in the second case in order to transfer it to the human self-relationship, at the risk of losing its most precious quality, finite animation, and inducing it to speculations in which it can only lose, assuming there are no gains elsewhere, such as high ethical sensitizations to compensate for the losses. I shall conclude this digression by noting that for a contemporary philosophical psychology, the only path that remains is the middle one, equidistant from the Hindu and Buddhist over non-animation. I would therefore advise there neither a leap into being nor a leap into nothingness. Instead of promoting self-sacrifice on one side or the other, it argues for the connection between effort and self-experience. This alliance opens up the paths of increase and transformation on which the moderns seek their optimizations. The Apostle. Against such a background, it is not difficult to make the third figure of spiritual trainerdom, which is responsible for the Christian transmission of the impossible to ever new generations of adepts, understandable. Its basic form is that of apostolic succession, in which the art of immortality, coded as faith, is passed on. As illustrated above with the example of Paul, no illumination needs be presupposed for this. The result of movedness and commitment is sufficient. The two highest forms of the imitatio Christi are on the one hand martyrdom, which was understood by its observers as a direct transition to the kingdom of God, which is why, according to some authors, martyrs were exempted from any form of further purification in the beyond. And on the other hand, the Christomorphic transformation of man that was meant to lead to the point where the Logos and Caritas take possession of the entire human person. What distinguished the greatest performance artist of the High Middle Ages, St. Francis of Assisi, was his resolve to unify the two extremes of imitatio in his person, which could only be achieved by equating life in utter poverty with the martyr's agon. The general form of the Christian imitatio contract can be seen in the choice of apostolic existence as such, which is always based in some way on the change of subjects. Its schema was defined by Paul in the statement from Galatians 2:20, "I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." This identifies the imitatio as a two-sided relationship in which one can distinguish between an imitatio subjectiva and an imitatio objectiva. Via subjective imitation, the imitator refers to Christ himself, or to a first-degree imitator of Christ, such as a martyr or a miracle-working saint. By imitating the inimitable, the Christian zealot can himself become an object of imitation by third parties. In the position of the imitable imitator, he follows the call to be exemplary and subordinates his own existence to the formal law of exemplary life. It is in this sense that Eugippus, in the introduction to his Vita Sancti Severini, the life of the 5th century saint from Mautern an der Donau, in the Austrian Krems district, quotes Peter's command to his deacons, "Be an example to the flock," forma estoti gregi, as well as Paul's instructions to Timothy, "Be an example to the faithful," forma isto fidelibus. In the original Greek, forma is replaced by typos. Hence, the Christian teacher is destined not only to be an imitator of Christ himself, but also to take the position of the imitable and make himself available to the communities of believers as a formant, a shaping type. Hence the dictum, a Christian is one who makes others Christians. The secular duplicates of this cliché lead to the theses that only those who guide others to education are themselves educated, and that only those who spread enlightenment can be called enlightened. Through the two-sided imitatio, apostolic succession takes on the form of a pyramid game, in which each participant is at once imitator and imitated, except for the simple believers at the base who only imitate without being imitated. It is their prerogative to fund the advanced with material contributions. They are naturally furthest from the tip of the pyramid, where the advanced jostle one another in the art of the impossible. Among these, next to the declared saints and miracle workers, one also finds the type of abbot, of which the Benedictine rule states that he has taken over the duty of guiding souls, animas regere, and must one day give account for his wards in fear and trembling. The statesmanship of the monastic director, we read, consists in doing the right thing at the right time, which means combining flattery with terror, and the severity of the Lord with the kindness of the Father. The philosopher. If we now cast a glance at the fourth trainer figure in our list, represented by the philosopher, we are immediately struck by its fragmentation into the erotic, statuary, and Gnostic types. As Pierre Hadot has shown very eloquently, Socrates embodies the first of these, Marcus Aurelius the second, and if anyone was suitable to represent the third type alongside these, it would be Plotin, the master of logical ascents above the physical world. We are also indebted to Hadot for a clear reconstruction of the Socratic procedure as seduction in the service of the ideal. By feigning, with a responsible irony, love for his pupil, he gains the latter's love in return, and proceeds to direct it from his person to the insight as such. He himself can only love upwards, and wishes to teach this way of loving as the only truthful one. While the students train with the master trains with the agathon. By conveying a love for the absolute, he resembles, from a distance, certain psychoanalysts who seek to liberate their patients' world imminently to their insane love. Hence, love your symptom as yourself, and, quoting Lacan, never retreat from its desire. The erotic imitatio philosophy could only be stimulated to the extent that the master represented a sufficiently impressive typos of philosophical life. In this sense, one could speak of the birth of philosophy from the spirit of performance. The death of Socrates wholly confirms this diagnosis. Whereas modern aesthetic performance generally remains as self-referential as it is inconsequential, and scarcely encourages imitation. The classical form aims entirely for the exemplary. Nietzsche was still able to say that a master only takes himself seriously with regard to his pupils. The contours of philosophical mimesis come to light even more clearly among the statuary philosophers, who largely identified themselves with the Stoic movement. Seneca usually calls them simply our people. They embody that type of practical philosophy in the ancient style which made the greatest impression on the public. The figure of the ascetic sage who, against the background of an ontology of world divinity, works on equating the ability to live with the ability to die. It was in Stoicism, after all, that the metaphorical equation of philosophical concern for oneself and sculptural work on the inner statue enabled a veritable training consciousness to ensue. Seneca does not simply appropriate the successful results of this work for himself. He simultaneously claims, only half in jest, a copyright on the intellectual progress of his pupil. He even tells him to his face, "Meum opus es," you are my work. Hence the pupil is doing nothing wrong in offering himself to the teacher as a great gift, ingens munus. At the same time, he reminds his student of the principle that teachers are not our masters, but leaders. Non domini nostri sed duces. The Stoic teachers hardly ever permit doubts as to the necessity of studying with a master, even though one can feel the beginnings of the idea of internalizing the master principle clearly within reach. This could be taken up by more modern schools, which declared the external master merely a temporary augmenter of the inner one. The sophist as universally able. It may seem bewildering to conclude this summary overview of trainer figures in the field of the élan of impossibility with that of the sophist. This confusion is easily removed as soon as one recalls to mind that the sophists, going on their achievements and their own self-image, were by no means simply intellectual lightweights portrayed in the Platonic counter-propaganda. If one leaves aside the caricatures, it transpires that sophistry, in its essence, was an artistry of knowledge. One could even say that an artistic doctrine of knowing everything and being capable of anything, without which the attractiveness of the philosophical life form in antiquity could not be so readily explained. As contradictory as it might sound, by seeking to make the impossible teachable, far beyond the Socratic Platonic promise to capture virtue, arete, within a school framework, it produced, as far as Western tradition is concerned, the first comprehensive science of training in the narrower sense of the word. It did this by consistently relating the processual side of upbringing, paideia, and tuition, didaskalia, to the form of training, ascesis and mileti. It thus pointed energetically to a principle of progress, the gradualness of increases in achievement, as well as the imperceptible yet effective growth into more improbable habitus. Because they viewed learning more as being shaped through interaction and repetitive practice than an active mental grasping of the material, the sophists were probably the first to place an emphasis on early education in order to ensure the naturalization of the improbable from childhood onwards. All ability is thus trapped in a circle of diligence. One only does what one is able to do, and one is only able to do what one constantly repeats. In this purely hexic analysis, however, that is, one oriented towards an active formation of habit, the agent of increase in the praxis of repetition, namely the only recently discovered network of neuro-rhetorical rules, remains unacknowledged, and is only drawn upon implicitly. For the time being, all didactics is summed up by the admonition, practice, 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 a slogan whose echo one still hears in Lenin's learn, learn, and learn again, and to which even Rodin's sublime toujours travailler responds from afar. Sophist theory can therefore only constitute a practicing praxis of thinking and imagining. The paradigm of an ability wholly embedded in constant practice is the mother tongue, which we could not master if we had not always been in a seemingly obvious and natural, but in truth quite miraculous circle of ability and application, practice and improvement. This can serve to demonstrate the miracle that is intended to become the school subject. Everyone has always spoken in some way or other, but only the sophist makes an art of his speech like no other, about everything in every situation, always well and mostly victoriously. That is why it is necessary to climb, with the right teacher, from within the mother tongue to the all-encompassing tongue. The nub of the sophist learning model is demonstrated in the sophist's leap from language competency to general life competency, even applied omniscience. through the constant company of an artist of ability, the speaking and living master of his school, who knows everything because he speaks about everything, and can in fact do anything that belongs to the higher ability to live, the practicing of universal ability increasingly rubs off on the adept, until he too is ready to enter public life as a pan-technically shaped individual who knows everything, can do anything. Who knows everything and can do anything. The things that cannot be anticipated by practice alone, the situative imponderabilities, are heard by the true man of skill in the spirit of the moment, kairos. And even this balancer on the tip of the favourable moment can, within limits, be trained. In its own way, then, sophistic education goes beyond the physical. Its concept of metaphysics is unmistakably a form of artistry. Sophistic artistry formulates the existential antithesis of helplessness. The cultivation of never helpless individuals is the goal of all such paideia. Nothing comes closer to the practical ideal of the polis citizen, and even more the polis politician, than the image of a human who is always in training and knows how to help themselves in any situation. This is why, if we look closely, we always enjoy watching circus artistes. They spread the good news of the invincible mobility of the body, and for the same reason a well-built and effectively delivered speech always concerns us. It reminds us of the humanly possible in the closest proximity, while the untrained human fall silent in their lack of means. The sophistic teacher shows the trained adept how to find the words to overcome suffering due to amechania, lack of means and helplessness in any situation. As much as this education places the emphasis on gradual growth into artistic superiority to all challenges, it is equally a performative, indeed a theatrical matter. Nowhere is this clearer than in an anecdote about Gorgias. One day he came to the theatre in Athens, which was fully booked, ready to improvise a random speech, and boldly called out to the audience, "Name any subject." Probability. To understand the meaning of this appearance, one must realize that Gorgias acted very self-confidently, but in no way inappropriately, as he was genuinely willing and able to give a sample of his pan-sophical and pan-rhetorical skill in any situation. It was with a similar gesture that until the end of the 18th century some pianists would appear and elaborate spontaneous dissertations and notes for their audiences on random themes, like sophists at the piano. In this sense, the young Mozart was one of the great sophists in music history, albeit one who largely called out his own themes, assuming he did not leave this to the librettist. Franz Liszt, too, the inventor of the solo piano recital, 1839, was still wont to improvise on spontaneously chosen themes before a large audience. For the piano sophists, the nature of their profession and the manner of its exercise meant that all learning had to be wholly embedded in the praxis of practice. As far as the magic of the pan-sophical and pan-technic habitus cultivated by the sophists is concerned, it extended very much further than one would think after Plato's defensive battles against the challenge of their position. It was Aristotle, no less, who did the sophists' pretensions the honour of taking their aim of saying something about everything at face value. In this sense, he was more an imitator of Gorgias than Plato. He paid tribute to his own teacher by replacing the pan-rhetorical habitus by a pan-epistemic one. I shall conclude these observations by noting that the sophistic idea of universal ability experienced an unexpected resurrection in the 20th century, in the form of the deconstruction developed by Jacques Derrida. This, in its basic procedure, is nothing other than a reinstatement of sophistic omniscience in the form of omni-commentary, or imminent omni-refutation. As we know, the key to the sophistic art of omniscience lay in the artful trick, mechany, of always letting the other speaker forge ahead with a thesis, an elaborated speech, even an entire theory, and subsequently employing the technique of rebuttal, anti-lagion. This, as Plato showed, was also a method of Socrates. Anti-lagion starts from the foundation of knowing equally well, which is already secured through the other's exposition, though often only borrowed from it, and directly ascends to the level of knowing better. This is always simple to attain if one considers how easily one can prove the inevitable existence of weak points in the first text. Such passages can be found almost effortlessly, even in the discourses of the masters, by recalling the selection that underlies every decisive thesis. It seems that Gorgias, the all-knowing, and Socrates, the all-not-knowing, were reunited in Derrida to launch a neo-acrobatic form of sophistic knowledge art, or a philosophistical sophism that regarded constant practice and existed only in practice. It was as good as certain that a new academic reaction would resist this. The profane trainer, the man who wants me to want. It is only a short way from the figure of the noble sophist, which, for the reasons detailed above, I wanted to place closer to the spiritual artistic teachers than the pragmatic ones, to the second group of trainers. I will speak briefly here of such teachers who concern themselves with passing on more specialized techniques and praxis-related complexes of abilities. It is an obvious choice to begin with the athletic trainer, as this embodies the most striking figure in the field of technically transmittable improbability. Like every trainer, the athletic one has a supportive procedure best described as the technique of interlocking motivation, while every athlete has a decent proportion of will to success of their own accord. It is nonetheless the trainer's duty to implant in this will a second will, their own, which heightens the first and helps it to rise above its crises. Through the alteration of the willing will, by such a willed will, the athlete can be carried to heights of achievement that could never have been reached without the interlocking of the two wills. Athletism, then, is the original practice field of harnessed spontaneity that later, in a monotheistic context, bore such strange fruit as the scholastic discussions on free or unfree will, de libero vel servo arbitrio. This problem was solved on the sports field long before philosophers entangled themselves in it. Theologians who, seeking to penetrate the mystery of the contradiction between human freedom and divine omnipotence, teach that we should freely want what God wants us to want, generally no longer understand that in doing so they have made God a successor to the athletic trainer. The definition of the trainer is that they want the athlete to want what they, the trainer, want for them. Needless to say, the athlete is meant to want something that is not entirely impossible, but fairly improbable, an unbroken series of victories. The master craftsman and the two natures of the work of art. The second type in the pragmatic field is embodied by the craftsman, or, philosophically put, one in command of a professionally everyday techne. With aptitudes of this type, one no longer sees, once they have been routinized and trivialized, and even on Greek soil, and on Greek soil even Philisteinized, that every single one of them came from a slow, cumulative revolt against helplessness, a quiet rebellion against the forlornness, lack of means, and lack of cunning for which the Greeks coined the profound word and spirit name, amechania, absence of mechany, lack of tricks and truk, or of leverage and tools. In this sense, all craftsmanship constitutes a collective and anonymous counterpart to one of the 12 labours of Hercules, these pan-technic acts of heroism whose unmistakable purpose was to prove that it is in man's nature, or demigods in this case, to master seemingly insurmountable tasks. Whoever has no interest in craftsmen should therefore be equally silent about heroes. From the perspective of the ability to do something, heroes, craftsmen, and finally also politicians belong much closer together than the old European doctrines of action, which were usually aristocratically inclined. We're able to recognise, even Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, 1957 or 8, admirable in all other respects, paid far too great a tribute to traditional distortions by pushing the activity of making, let alone of mere working, rather grossly into the second and third positions, far behind action, that is to say, the political behaviour of humans. In the light of this, it had to be considered not merely a great academic, but in fact intellectual historical deed, when Richard Sennett recently attempted to liberate the crafts from the disdain they were shown by philosophical theory, and restore to these fundamental, yet unnoticed factors their due rank among the phenomena of the vita activa. The principle of craft is based on the coincidence of production and practice. Finally, recognising this again is what makes Sennett's venture on activity-theoretical terrain so significant. Whoever defends the crafts, eo ipso shields repetitive learning with all its slowness and lack of originality. Such a gesture presupposes that one can give repetition, much maligned in modernity, a new mark of honour. Anyone who attempts this must prove the reconcilability of the repetitive mechanical and the personal spontaneous, an undertaking that leads directly to a praise of individually embodied memories, and thus what one could, quoting Nietzsche, call incorporation, Einverleibung, or invoking Ravaison, the system of acquired abilities. Anyone who remembers the curriculum of the older craft professions knows that no one is born a master. According to this curriculum, an apprentice had to be initiated into the techniques of his profession for at least 7 years before he could take the final examination. After this, the journeyman perfected his art for another 5 to 10 years, and only after 12 to 18 years of teaching and practicing could he consider the production of his final masterpiece. According to an old rule of thumb, at least 10,000 hours of practicing praxis are required to become a decent craftsman or a reasonable musician. If one includes higher levels of mastery, one can safely double or even triple that number. Until recently, what we call genius merely referred to cases in which these average practice times were spectacularly shortened. Recall musical child prodigies. The music history of the last 3 centuries would be barely conceivable without them. In the end, a genius aesthetic plague befell entire populations of artists who were anything but Wunderkinder, yet wanted to push this shortening as far as the complete omission of practice. The phenomenon of craftsmanly mastery is of paradigmatic significance for an understanding of both the ancient and the modern vita activa, as it marks the beginning of the process whereby the artistic mirabile became commonplace. Whether the craft is shipbuilding, a discipline Plato enjoys weaving into his discussion of the nature of technique, surgery, pottery, or goldsmithery, Sennett, as a critic of modern fragmentation of abilities and demoralisation of mere job work, is especially fond of the last of these. The respective craftsmen are producers of artifices that overstep the circle of natural things in varyingly conspicuous ways. Because of their standardised, serial and everyday character, these works of quote-unquote art have mostly ceased to be an object of admiration, though that does not stop their production from requiring a substantial amount of practice, experience, care, and vigilance. This activity in the field of an anonymised and degraded artificiality provides the ideal conditions for a type of production located precisely on the threshold between fabrication and meditation. It stimulates a practicing work in which the agent reproduces and expands their competence to perform this very work on the same effect, to the same effect that they immerse themselves in the production of the object or effect. This explains why every conscientiously performed work of craftsmanship can be of spiritual surplus value. When, in the European cities of the late Middle Ages, a massive wave of lay religiosity developed that would culminate in the devotio moderna of the 14th century and the Reformation of the early 16th century, this was scarcely connected to the supposed affinity between capitalism and Protestantism, of which Max Weber had made too much in his well-known study, and far more to the blatant analogies between monastic exercises and those found in the workshops. The practicing work of the crafts, the Parisian Livre des Métiers, listed over 150 guild-based artisan professions as early as 1268, had to produce a type of personality that would become increasingly aware of its potential spiritual equality with professional clerics. Just as order et labora had long been the rule for most monks, the more up-to-date maxim, labora et order, presented itself urgently to the secular brothers of artisanal life. There are also many sources documenting direct moves of individual craftsmen from monastic workshops to urban ones, meaning that the transfer of the spiritual habitus, the self-moulding of the actor in regular vigilant activity, to the larger artisanal milieu, could even take place by the shortest route on occasion. In this sense, the workshops are not simply the places where pure equipment, Zeug, is called into existence. They are at once plantations for a form of subjectivity suspended between production and contemplation, mints for self-assuredly pious singularities. Occasionally the spark flies back into the religious field, as with the British Methodists, who applied the craft of devout enthusiasm to their own psyche. From here it is only a short way to the secession of the arts from the crafts, that most activity-theoretically relevant spectacle of the modern age, before the onset of the one even greater drama, the crystallization of modern labour as such, labour sans phrase, the labour without qualities, in which Marx found the systemic definition of the proletarian condition as an illusion-free self-sale of the universally available commodity of labour power. Like all secessions, this one too serves the purpose of a heightened subjectification, in this case the boosting of the craftsman's ability to that of the artist. What distinguishes art from craftsmanship is its resolve to display the ability to art as much as in the piece of work, opus. Sennett illustrates this leap from the simple consumer item to the work narcissistic dimension with Benvenuto Cellini's famous salt cellar, the Vienna Saliera, 1540-43, which he crafted for Francis I in over 3 years of work. Such objects no longer tolerate everyday use. They force the user to yield to the compulsion to admire that is fashioned into them. It was only after protracted dogmatic quarrelling that the two natures of the work of art were laid down with the appropriate clarity: holy craft or holy mirabilia. With the one side, each work remains the creation of the profession through and through, and with the other it testifies to the irruption of the supra-artisanal into the workshop. The two natures exist unmixed alongside each other and are recognized through different receptive capacities. All the upgradings of both the master status and the concept of the masterpiece that have animated discussions about art and artists since the Renaissance are connected to this. Just as art means the reconquest of the wonderful from the position of the workshops, the artist's existence implies restoring the creative, almost godly competency within the workshop, with the side effect that for almost half a millennium, Europeans have been subject to a constant intermission by theologians of creativity and their critical deacons, though also a slightly later Arian spelled with an I here, or humanistic materialistic countermission, whose message is that even the greatest works of art are no more than higher products, that is to say, simulations of something higher, and even the greatest artists are only human. Professors, teachers, writers. I shall conclude this overview with a summary description of the three remaining types of pragmatic teaching license. The university professors, the teachers at the primary and secondary schools of modern nations, and finally, Enlightenment writers and politico-culturally committed journalists. From a historical perspective, these authorized teachers and speakers are largely involved in a drama that could be described as the progressive self-abolition of the privilege of education, or the democratization of the elites. In a process drawn out over several centuries, many of them, never without opposing tendencies complicating and deflecting the course of the development, devoted themselves increasingly explicitly to the aim of rendering the trainer obsolete through the training. They reinforce the depersonalizing tendency of toughening exercises by shifting the emphasis from the person of the teacher to the learning field, the faculty, the school, the press, a tendency that, since the growth of internet communities, the most immediate illustration of the phenomenon today, becomes easier to identify retrospectively as early as Gutenberg's time, even in the age of manuscripts. If one looks back at the figure of the old European professor, one immediately notices that he was never meant to be, nor ever wanted to be, more than a character mask of his subject, and how little he was initially expected to make any original contribution to the advancement of his science. Until recently, an original professor was a contradiction in terms, and still is today essentially, except that the contradictions now have slightly better living conditions, especially in the humanities, where teachers are allowed to speak not only professorially, but also within limits enthusiastically and expressively. The name, professor, already indicates the vocation to reproduce and pass on whatever the state of the art required. And if the bearer of such a title received an honorarium from the state, it was in acknowledgement of the energetic unoriginality with which he was able to teach his subject as a whole. Professors belong to an economy of ordinated secular knowledge in which the professorial chair is strictly superior to its holder, just as at the next highest level, the priority of the faculty over the chair is never in doubt. The faculty is the impersonal self of a discipline, whereas the individual professors act de facto and de jure as mere personifications of a teaching and learning process that has long been supra-personally institutionalized. If the chairholders can look back on qualification processes of 20 to 30 years, they constitute the average in their discipline. In their totality, they form a collective subject that, at the start of the modern age, was given, not without reason, the title Res Publica Literaria, the Scholars' Republic. To explain the nature of its task, one would first have to point to the expanded reproduction of cognitive capitals with which academic life concerns itself. One would perhaps have to emphasize even more that this res publica ultimately constituted a crypto-Platonic political body, the replacement of the simple pyramid of the philosopher's kingdom with the complex polyhedron of the philosopher's republic. The former sought to guide a city that would have been governable via a completed science of principles against the background of a static nature. The latter is based on the self-administration of a polity exposed, both in terms of principles and nature, to an unforeseeable dynamization. If one is prepared to understand the faculty, the university, and the Scholars' Republic as collectivizations, anonymizations, and perfections of the master function, and this means judging the Enlightenment more highly than it usually judges itself, then one can make analogous statements about the next two steps of pragmatic trainer functions, namely writers and journalists. They carry the toughening process on which the res publica of the knowing is based to the respective wider levels. First into the classrooms, from which tomorrow's literate individuals capable of judgment and action will emerge, and then into the public media that serve the communication among today's society of the knowing. From this perspective, the teachers are character masks of the school system, just as journalists are personifications of the press. So they too, if they wanted to see themselves in that way, would serve a positive dynamic of collectivization that sought to expand a particular quality to the level of society as a whole, a quality long believed to be afforded only to the few, that of mastery, be it the solving of a factual problem or the art of living as such. But as long as the collectivization of mastery, in philosophical terms the self-determination of society, as if society could possess a self, does not take place, individuals would do well to continue practicing as if they were the first who will reach the goal.